Welcome to our final session of summer school. I will be reading the last few chapters of the book at the back of the class today. Okay, so today's objective is to complete your book review to show that you've read it, and your success criteria is that you can write a detailed account of your feelings about the novel that we have read together. So before we read the final three chapters, the interview, the Queen's message and the present, we're going to look at three final vocab words. So let's do that first. Okay, word number one, radical. Okay, so this is not a word that you don't often hear used. It's quite a specific word. Radical is an adjective, and it's if someone is described as a radical, they support an extreme change in society. So people like Greta Thunberg would be considered radical, someone who's really trying to change society. Synonyms for radical are revolutionary, progressive, reforming, extreme, extremist. And we've got an example there, radical refugee terrorists. Next word, influx. Okay, is a noun. And if there is an influx, it means the arrival of a large number of things, people or things. So in September, we're going to have an influx of new books into our library. Synonyms for influx are inundation or being inundated, a rush, stream or a flood. No more, refugee, influx, flood in Britain. These words are already making me feel a bit nervous about the final three chapters. And last but not least, plight. Okay, we've looked at this word before, but we're going to look at it again because it's important. A plight is a dangerous or difficult situation. So synonyms for that are predicament, trouble, mess or bind. I'm very sorry to hear of Ahmet's plight. Okay, so head to your booklet and complete your words before I read the next chapters. Pause your video now. Okay, let's get this finished. So I've no idea of how this ends, by the way. I've been reading it along with you for the first time, so I'm really excited to see whether Ahmet finds his parents. Okay, chapter 24, the interview. Although Brendan the bully wasn't bullying Ahmet anymore and Mr. Irons was gone, I was still feeling worried. 8 whole days had passed since our emergency adventure, and Ahmet's parents still hadn't been found. And even though Mrs. Sanders had said the Queen couldn't really help us, I knew that deep down we were all still hoping that she would do something. The hardest thing was trying to make Ahmet understand that the Queen hadn't been able to help. Every morning, as soon as he would see us in the playground, he would ask, "The Queen will find today, yes?" After a few days of trying to tell him no and seeing him look sad, we began to shrug and say, maybe, as hopefully as we could. The gates will have been shut last Friday, said Josie quietly, as she gave her ponytail an angry pull. Even though we didn't usually have PE on Thursdays, Mrs. Khan had decided to treat us, so we were all sitting on a bench waiting for the climbing frame and feeling sad. Ahmet, your turn, said Tom, pointing to the free space at the climbing frame. Ahmet ran over to the bars and leapt up to the highest rung he could reach. He was as good at climbing as he was at football. When I asked him how he could jump so high and climb so fast, he shrugged and said, fences. If the gates are shut already, and no one's helping us to find Ahmet's family, why do you think the reporters are still here, said Michael, carefully patting the sides of his afro hair, said it would stay in place when it was his turn at the climbing frame. It was a question all of us had been asking ourselves, because even though there were fewer reporters than last week, they were all still asking us questions about Ahmet whenever they saw us. Maybe they think we'll try and do something else to help Ahmet find his family, and they're just waiting to see what it is, suggested Josie. For the rest of the day, we tried our best not to think about the reporters and the newspaper appeal and the Queen, but on the way back home, a reporter suddenly shouted out, "Kids, what do you think of Mr. Fry's views about refugees, children like Ahmet?" And another one shouted, "Do you have a response? Do you want to say something back to him?" We all said no comment, just like we always did, but we gave each other a puzzled look. None of us knew who Mr. Fry was, or what he had to do with us or Ahmet, but we promised each other we would try and find out that night. When I got home that afternoon, I found lots more reporters in front of my flat. It was strange because there used to only be 1 or 2 before, but now there were at least 50. They were all shouting questions to me about Mr. Fry. I ran past all of them just as fast as I could and saw Mum standing just inside the main door looking out for me. "Mum," I cried out, running up and hugging her as she quickly buzzed the door open. "You're home early." Mum hugged me back and hurried inside. When we got to our flat, I could see the television was on, which was another sign that something odd was happening, because Mum only really watches telly at night. Quickly switching off the telly, Mum bent down to look at me closely and asked, "Are you okay?" It can be scary having so many people chasing you and asking questions. I nodded, but, Mum, why are you home early? Mum stroked my cheek before replying, because I need you to do something really important and help us all to help Ahmet. Motioning for me to sit down at the kitchen table, Mum placed a large peanut butter sandwich in front of me and a glass of milk. My stomach gave a growl because it likes peanut butter sandwiches the best, even though they make my mouth go sticky. Darling, do you know who Mr. Fry is? He came to your school once, a long time ago. He's our local MP. I frowned and shook my head, but the reporters were asking about him. Mum nodded. I bet they were, she said, shaking her hand as she sat down opposite me. Shaking her head as she sat down opposite to me. Grabbing some newspapers from the kitchen counter, she spread them out in front of me. This is why, she said. Her voice was calm, but her cheeks were pink, and I could tell she was cross about something. I looked down at the newspapers. They were all different, but all of them had the same picture on the front page. It was of a man with grey hair, wearing a dark suit and a blue tie, and above him in big letters were headlines like, No more refugee influx flooding Britain, and Britain's needs must come first, and MP Fry labels Buckingham Palace kids radical refugee terrorists. So this guy, who's a member of parliament, he's someone representing, this area, and the government thinks that our narrator is a terrorist, a radical terrorist. So that's an interesting judgment, isn't it? My heart beat fast at the last headline, but before I could read anything else, Mum gathered the papers back up again. Let's put these aside for now, darling. I don't want you to read the articles because most of it is just silly nonsense. I watched as Mum turned to put the newspapers back onto the counter and then faced me again. The reason I showed them to you is because I wanted you to see the kind of headlines Mr. Fry has helped create today, and for you to understand that there are some people, like him, who think refugee children, like Ahmet, shouldn't be allowed into the country. But why not, Mum? I asked, feeling angry. They haven't done anything wrong. I know that, and I'm sure deep down they know that too. But remember what we said about some people being afraid of anyone different to them. So you mean Mr. Fry and all the people like him are just like Mr. Greggs? I asked, scrunching up my nose as if the name smelled. Yes, exactly, grinned Mum. After a few seconds the grin disappeared. And there's something else you need to know. Mr. Fry, you see, has said it was Ahmet who made you and Tom go to Buckingham Palace that day, and but that's a lie, I cried out, feeling my cheeks beginning to burn. I noticed, darling, and so do lots of other people, but that's why I've had a long talk on the phone with Mrs. Sanders, and well, we've come up with a plan. I sat up, pushing my sandwich plate away, told my ears to listen carefully because any plan of my mum's would be the best plan ever. Now, we think that people like Mr. Fry shouldn't be on the front pages of any newspaper. It's your story and Ahmet's story that people need to hear. So how would you feel about talking to reporters today and telling them all about your letter to the Queen and Ahmet trying to find his family and all the things that you've done for each other? But you told me to say no comment. I know I did, said Mum. I wanted to protect you and Ahmet too, but when people like Mr. Fry start telling lies, it's time to speak out. So you mean I should tell them about the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan and the Queen and everything? I asked, feeling both scared and excited. Yes, said Mum, but it won't just be you on your own. Tom and Josie and Michael and Ahmet will be with you too, and you can all share your story together. I clapped my hands. Mum, that is the best plan in the whole world. Mum laughed and, getting up, said, I'm glad you think so. Now finish that sandwich and let's get back to school. Mrs. Sanders suggested we hold the interview in your classroom, so we need to be there in, Mum looked at her watch, half an hour. Plenty of time for you to go and wash your face and look your best too. Chop, chop. I gobbled down my peanut butter sandwich, gulped down my glass of milk, scrubbed my face, brushed my hair, polished my school shoes, and checking I had the greatest idea in the world with me in my rucksack, got Mum to tie my school tie extra neatly. I thought I'd done everything in 3 minutes, but then Mum said that was good for 10 minutes, which made me look at the clock and shake my head at it. As we headed downstairs to the main door, Mum grabbed my hand and said, We're going to have to run very fast to the bus stop, okay? Let's pretend all the journalists are zombies out to get us. I nodded and grabbed Mum's hand tightly. I tried to tell my heart to stop thumping so loudly, because there weren't really any zombies around, but it wouldn't listen. And as soon as Mum opened the door, I ran just as fast as I could, pulling Mum behind me. I heard her say, in a rush, no comments until we reached the bus stop. When we got to school and walked into our classroom, Tom and Michael and Josie were already there with their parents, and Ahmet was with his foster mum and Miss Hemsby too. Mrs. Khan was talking to 2 people I'd never seen before, but Michael told us that one was a lawyer and the other one was a caseworker. What do you think they're all talking about? Asked Josie, looking at the grown-up standing in the corner and whispering. Probably about that horrible MP who's been saying Armit made us go to Buckingham Palace, I said. Really? Asked Josie. Mum and Dad didn't tell me anything like that. They just said if I helped tell the story, we'd get some money for a proper holiday. Just then, Mrs. Sanders walked in, followed by a woman in a suit and a man with a camera. It's them, whispered Josie loudly. They're reporters. Everyone, said Mrs. Sanders, waving them forward. This is Miss Hall and Mr. Myers. We all looked up at Miss Hall and Mr. Myers, who smiled and waved at us. And this is Armet's caseworker, Mrs. Khalid, said Mrs. Khan, pointing at the woman in the glasses standing next to Michael's mum. We all smiled. Let's begin, shall we? Clapped Mrs. Sanders. First, Miss Hall is going to speak to the four of you about the greatest idea in the world, and then she's going to speak to Armet with Miss Hemsby's help, of course. And Mr. Myers will be filming you all, and then we'll take some nice pictures of the plans. Have you got them? Right here, said Mum, holding up my rucksack. After Mrs. Sanders and everyone had finished fussing over our hair and collars and jumpers and ties, we all sat in a row and the interview began. It only lasted 10 minutes, but it felt much, much longer. Miss Halls asked us what made Armet so special and why he had wanted to help him. It was hard answering more than one question at the same time, especially with so many grown-ups and a large camera staring at us. But Tom said it was because Armet was the only boy he had ever met who had seen real bombs and guns and had been fast enough to run away from them. And Michael said anyone who had walked millions of miles to come to school deserved to be helped. And Josie said that Armet was the best footballer she'd ever seen, even better than her, and that it wasn't fair that he didn't know where his parents were. And I said that Armet was the bravest person I'd ever met, because even though he had run away from a real-life war and found it hard to speak English and missed his family all the time, he was still the best kind of friend anyone could have. After that, Miss Hall asked us about the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan, so we showed her in the camera the drawings and talked about how we had gone to the Queen for help, because we thought she could do anything. And are you disappointed that Queen hasn't contacted you? Asked Miss Hall. We all nodded. What would you say to her if you could? In fact, what would you say to everyone out there listening to you today? Asked Miss Hall. That the gates need to be kept open, said Tom without hesitating. Yes, said Michael. They should be kept open for everyone like Armet. And everyone needs to help Armet find his parents, because it's not their fault they've gone missing. Miss Hall nodded and, looking at me, waited for an answer. I wanted to say lots of things to the Queen and the Prime Minister, but instead I said, I think we should help anyone who's a refugee, just like my Grandma Jo did. I heard Mum gasp as Miss Hall leant forward. Your Grandma Jo helped refugees too? She asked, looking interested. I nodded. In the World War, the second one. And how did she help them? Asked Miss Hall. I looked over at Mum, who nodded at me, her eyes wide and watery. She ran away from the Nazi people, and then she helped other people run away from them too. So we know for definite now that our narrator is from a Jewish background. Miss Hall cleared her throat and then, giving me a smile, turned to Armet to ask him all about all the things he had seen and what he had run away from. I watched as Miss Hemsley helped him translate what he wanted to say into English, but I liked his last answer the best, because when Miss Hall asked him how he felt about what we had done, he looked at us and without any help he said, "I'm happy to have best friends on planet." And just like that, I knew the answer to my very last question. When we got home that night, Mum took me into bed and said she was proud of me, and that wherever Dad and Grandma Jo were, they were proud of me too. In fact, I think if Grandma Jo were alive today, she'd give you a big fat kiss and tell you exactly what she told your dad when he was your age, said Mum, stroking my hair. What was that, Mum? That the entire world is full of hearts searching for a place to call home, but refugees are different, because they don't just look for a home, they look for peace too. And because of that, they possess the most special hearts anyone could ever have. Hearing about what my Grandma Jo had said to my dad made me so happy that I couldn't sleep for a really long time, not until I heard an owl hooting from somewhere very far away. The next morning I woke up extra early and jumped out of bed. I thought Mum might still be asleep, but she was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, and in front of her was a newspaper. Morning, she said, smiling as a mug of tea steamed up her glasses. Thought I'd run out and get the paper. Look, she held it out to me. Staring back at me from the front page was a picture of me and Tom and Josie and Michael all sitting in a row. Tom and me were holding up the greatest idea in the world, and Josie and Michael were holding up the emergency plan. Next to it was an even bigger picture of Armet smiling, and above all our heads in big bold letters the words, Armet, the most famous refugee boy in the world. Exclusive. The children behind the Buckingham Palace protest. Come over here, you, said Mum, opening her arms. Let's read it together, shall we? School isn't for another 2 hours, so we have lots of time. Squeezing onto Mum's chair, I read the article with her. It ran on to 2 whole pages, but I liked the bits where Ahmet was speaking the best. He spoke about his family and where they might be, and how he dreamed of being a footballer one day. But he also spoke about his sister being in the sea, and how hard it was being bullied and having horrible songs sung about him. I hope that shuts up all the other bullies too, muttered Mum angrily when she read that bit. Mum, look, I cried as we turned over the page to read the second half of the article. There's you. I leaned forward to see the picture better. Mum was standing next to Tom's parents and Michael's parents and Josie's parents and Ahmet's foster mum, and the words underneath said, Parents unite to fight against racism and champion refugee rights. Racists like MP Fry have no right to tear innocent families apart. Mum, I asked after we finished reading the whole article, do you think the Queen and the Prime Minister and the border people will see this? Do you think they might all try and help now? Mum squeezed me tight. I don't know, darling, but what I do know is that by sharing our story, lots more people will be talking about it, and that has to be a good thing. I put my hands down on the newspaper and then had another thought. And do you think it might make people like Mr. Fry and Mr. Greggs be less scared of Ahmet? I'm not sure, said Mum, smiling, but when it comes to people, you just never know. I didn't know about Mr. Fry and Mr. Greggs, but on the way to school that day, Josie said that after her mum and dad had listened to Ahmet's story, that they had told her she'd been right to make friends with him. Now that's a massive deal, that, isn't it? Because remember, Josie's parents were quite bigoted against Ahmet. They didn't want Josie playing with him. They thought that he was going to cause trouble and he would steal things. So that's a really big change. So they've changed from listening to Ahmet's story. And that made me have a thought. Maybe it didn't matter if really horrible people like Mr. Fry and Mr. Gregg didn't like Ahmet. Maybe they didn't deserve to know him, but people like Josie's mum and dad did, because they weren't horrible at all. They had just been nervous about making a new friend, and I think that's a really good way of looking about it. Chapter 25, The Queen's Message. I thought we were pretty famous before the interview, but I was wrong. It was only after we became headline news that I found out what being famous was really like. Wherever we went, Tom and Michael and Josie and Ahmet and me were waved at and smiled at and patted on the head and given thumbs up by lots of people we didn't know. People at the bus stop and on the streets would run up and say things like, God bless you, and we're all behind you, Ahmet, and I just signed the petition. Parliament's going to listen to us, you'll see. Even Mr. Van Eyck, who opened the Red News Agents near the school bus stop and was famous for hating children, ran out whenever he saw us and gave us a chocolate egg for free, and not just for a day, but for a whole week. But as exciting as it was to be famous and to be friends with the most famous refugee boy in the world, what happened a few days later was even more surprising. On Wednesday morning, just 6 days after we'd done the interview, we arrived at school ready to play football, but couldn't find Ahmet anywhere in the playground. When the bell began to ring, we headed straight to class, but when we got to our classroom, he wasn't there either, neither was Miss Hemsby. He's probably just late, shrugged Josie as we sat down, but Ahmet was never ever late, and I looked over at Mrs. Khan and wondered if I should ask her. She was busy getting the class to sit down, but she looked happier and couldn't stop smiling, even when she was telling Clarissa for being late. After registration, Mrs. Khan said that Mrs. Bourneville was going to take first period today, as she had something to do, and she came over to me and Josie and Michael and Tom and told us to come with her. Are we in trouble? Whispered Tom, as we followed Mrs. Khan down the corridor. But we haven't done anything, have we? Whispered Josie. I didn't say anything. Me and Michael just looked at each other. Mrs. Khan knocked on Mrs. Sanders' door and waited for a come-in before she pushed it open. It was Ahmet. He was perched on the chair, his face looking surprised and serious and happy all in one go. Sitting on one side of him was Miss Hemsley, whose cheeks were pinker than I'd ever seen them, and on the other were 2 men. They gave me a wild smile. For a moment I couldn't remember how I knew them, and then Tom gave a gasp. It's the Queen's Guards, he cried out, punching me on the arm. He was right. They really were the Queen's Guards, except they weren't dressed in suits and didn't look so giant because they weren't wearing their tall black hats. As we walked in, they stood up and gave us a salute. Josie smiled in delight, and Mike was so excited he shook hands with both of them at the same time. I looked over at Ahmet, who, on seeing that we knew the guards, was now smiling at them fully. Come in, said Mrs. Sanders, waving us to our seats and peering over a glass at us. Children, these gentlemen have a very special message to give you, said Mrs. Sanders. We certainly do, said Lieutenant Kingo. It gives me great pleasure to present you with this very special message from Her Majesty the Queen. He took an envelope from the inside of his coat and held it up. And seeing how the greatest idea in the world was your idea, how about you open this, he asked, as he held the envelope out to me. It was large and square and cream, and had the curliest writing in it that I ever saw. As I took it, everyone crowded around me to stare at it. I turned it over. On the back was a large blob of red candle wax. It looked like it had been split accidentally, and there was a E-I-I-R stamped in the middle of it. so it must have been done on purpose. Go on, whispered Josie, and Ahmet and Michael and Tom nodded. I carefully peeled off the wax bob and pulled out the letter. The writing was so curly and scratchy, and I was so nervous that I couldn't read the words. Seeing me struggle, Mrs. Carn came and stood behind me. I gave her the letter. She could read it out loud instead. This is what it said. Dearest children, Lieutenant Chris Taylor and Second Lieutenant Walter Kungu were so kind as to inform me of your brave, although slightly dangerous, actions undertaken on behalf of your refugee friend Ahmet. I have now also received the letter you had written to me on the subject beforehand. Thank you for the very colourful envelope and the lovely stamps. Purple is quite my favourite colour. I am very sorry to hear of Ahmet's plight. I have heard of many little boys and girls like him. Thanks to your brave actions, lots of people from all over the world are working together to try and locate his family. I know they will all be trying their very best, and I look forward to hearing their safe revival to the United Kingdom, or Queendom, as you so nicely put it, soon. My lieutenants tell me that you have brought tea and biscuits and gifts in the hope of sharing them with me. That was a lovely idea. I am unfortunately scheduled to go on a small tour across Britain this week, but when I get back in a fortnight's time, I should like nothing better than to invite you all to have tea with me at the palace. Until then, I must ask that you please do not go running after any more of my soldiers. It was awfully dangerous. I am most relieved that you were not hurt. Any letter addressed to me will always reach me, and I do like to receive mail, especially one so beautifully decorated and written with such care. With my fondest wishes, Elizabeth R., 92 years old. After Mrs. Carner read it out loud for us, and Miss Hemsby had finished telling Ahmet what the letter said, we all sat in silence. I guess there are some things that even grown-ups don't have words for it, and a message from the Queen is one of them. Chapter 26. The Present. It's been 2 weeks since we were all in the newspaper and received the Queen's letter, and in lots of ways things feel just like they did before. Mum doesn't walk me to the bus stop anymore, and strangers have stopped staring at us with funny looks on their faces, and I'm still hoping to win first prize for my photosynthesis plant, even though Ahmet's plant is growing faster than everyone else's again. He's teaching me some words in Kurdish like grow more and grow up and I love you lots, and I think it's working. But in lots of other ways things aren't normal at all. Aunt Christina comes round much more often, and she buys me presents too. I think she likes us now because we're in the newspaper. I still don't like her. Whenever she comes, I ignore her and make my Uncle Lenny play Scrabble with me and Mum like he used to. Mr. and Mrs. Rashid on the floor below have invited Mum and me for dinner this weekend, which means Mum might have a new best friend. And next week, I'll be going with Tom and Josie and Michael and Ahmet to Buckingham Palace to have tea with the Queen. Sometimes I get so excited thinking about it, I have to jump up and down just as high as I can until my insides feel calmer. I think they must know that things can never be the same again after you've had tea with an actual queen. Mum asked me what I'd like to take as a present to the Queen, and I thought about it for 3 hours. In the end, I decided, as she doesn't really need anything, and I can't afford to buy real diamonds or a ruby, I would buy her a pomegranate from the man with the royal heart, because I think the next best thing to wearing lots of jewels must be to eat lots of little ones instead. The other thing that's changing is that I turned 10 today. When I woke up extra early this morning, I found the birthday card on the kitchen table. The birthday card is very old. It was the last one Dad gave to me before he died. And every year, Mum puts it out so he can be there to greet me when I wake up, just like he used to do when he was alive. It doesn't say much inside, just, to my pumpkin, happy birthday, try not to grow up too fast, love, Dad. I'm glad Mum had to leave to work early, because seeing the card always makes me want to sit down and cry. So I did. And then I went to my room and played one of Dad's favourite songs on his old record player. That made me feel better too. Sometimes all you really need is somewhere to cry without anyone ever knowing. I didn't remind anyone it was my birthday because I wasn't having a party, and I didn't have anything to take to class with me. Josie brings in a big cake on her birthday, and Michael's mum always hands out goodie bags to everyone. But Mum doesn't have time to bake, and goodie bags are expensive. That's why it's easy to pretend that I don't have a birthday at all. I met Tom and Josie and Michael by the bus stop as usual, and when they didn't say anything about my birthday, I felt sad and glad at the same time. I was afraid Mrs. Carr might say something, but she didn't. My Uncle Lenny usually sends me something in the post, so I probably would get home and find a card with some extra pocket money or chocolate in it like I did last year. If I did, that would be nice. At afternoon break, Josie, Tom and Michael and Ahmet and me talked about what we were going to wear to Buckingham Palace next week. Josie's mum was going to buy her a new dress and a new pair of football trainers. Michael was wearing a suit with a bow tie. Tom said a purple suit his uncle had made him wear to a wedding in San Francisco, but which might not fit anymore. And Ahmet said his foster mum was going to buy him something at the weekend, and that he would also take his rucksack. You can't take your rucksack with you, said Josie. It's old and ripped, it's got a hole in the front pocket. The Queen might not even let it inside the palace. But important, said Ahmet, looking panicked. My dad gave it to me birthday before war, and I carry from Syria. So next time I see it, I tell him it is seen by Queen. Oh, said Josie, looking sorry that she had said anything. Then you have to take it, I said. The Queen will want to see it. Yes, said Tom, and your dad will love it. Ahmet smiled and said, I know you understand. The bell for last period began to ring. As we all headed back to the class, we met Miss Hensey in the corridor outside. She was clasping her hands together and her eyes looked red. I think I'm going to end up crying at this bit. If Miss Hensey's seen crying, then Miss Murray's probably going to cry as well. As soon as she saw us, she ran over and whispering something in Ahmet's ear, took him by the hand and led him quickly away. Where's she taking him? Asked Josie, as Ahmet looked over his shoulder with a confused look in his face. None of us could think of an answer, so we made our way to class. After we'd all got our spelling books and had spent 10 minutes learning the meaning and spelling of 3 new words, possession, depression, and objection, there was a light knock on the door. We all looked around to see who it was, and after a few seconds Miss Hensey's head popped around the door, and after giving Mrs. Carn a thumbs up, disappeared again. Mrs. Carn smiled and clapping her hands said, Right, everyone, close your books, please. I have a very important announcement to make. We all felt very quiet and waited for an explanation about what was going on and where Ahmet was. Today is a very special day, said Mrs. Carn, and we have a few very special guests to help us celebrate. Everyone turned around to see if there was anyone at the door, but there was no one there yet. Eyes to the front, please, ordered Mrs. Carn. Now, before our guests arrive, I want you all to promise me to be on your very best behaviour. Everyone shouted, We promise, Mrs. Carn, wondering who the guest could be. Do you think it's a queen? Whispered Josie. Maybe it's the Queen's Guard again, whispered Tom. But we were both wrong, because it was my mum, carrying a cake with candles on it, and behind her was Mrs. Sanders and Ahmet's foster mum, and Miss Hensby, and the woman who had been at the interview, and who had said was Ahmet's caseworker, and another woman we'd never seen before who was walking with a hand on Ahmet's shoulder. I could tell Ahmet was happy because he was smiling, but his eyes looked wet and a little red too, just like Miss Hensby's had in the corridor. Oh, I wonder if it's Ahmet's mum. And within a few seconds, the whole class was singing happy birthday to me, just as loudly as they come. After Mum helped me light the candles, Ahmet and Miss Hensby and the woman who still had her hand on his shoulder stood at the front of the class with Mrs. Carn. Quieten down, please, called out Mrs. Carn. We'll cut the cake in just a few minutes, but first I want to say good afternoon to our extra special guest, Miss Duncan. The woman standing behind Ahmet stepped forward as everyone shouted out, Good afternoon, Miss Duncan. She was wearing a bright blue suit and a short grey hair and a green diamond ring. Now, Miss Duncan has come here today from very far away because she has some very important news to share with us all. Over to you, Miss Duncan. Miss Duncan nodded and looked straight at me with a smile before looking round at everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here from the Home Office, which is a government department that controls who comes in and out of our country. Like the police, called out Dean. No, not like the police, smiled Mrs. Duncan. She waited for a few more questions, but no one said anything. Everyone was deathly silent now, and I could feel my whole chest beating so hard that it felt like someone was playing drums inside my tummy. Miss Duncan carried on. Today I have the pleasure of bringing Ahmet some special news, and he's very kindly said that he would like to share it with all of you. Ahmet. She held out a plain white envelope that had no address on it and offered it to him, but Ahmet didn't take it and whispered something to Miss Hensby and said. Miss Hensby frowned first, but then laughing and crying all at once, gestured at me to come up. He would like his best friend to read it to everyone, she explained. For a moment I couldn't move. Then Josie gave me a kick under the table that made me stand up and slowly walk over to where Ahmet was standing. Miss Duncan waited until I was standing in front of her, and holding out the envelope said, A very happy birthday, Alexa, from all of us. Thank you to you and to Josie and to Michael and Tom, of course. There have been thousands of people writing in and signing petitions and calling our offices just to show how they could help Ahmet and lots of other refugees like him. And because of that, well, here you go. So now we know the narrator is called Alexa. That's the first time we found out her name. Ahmet nodded and added, Happy birthday, best friend. I opened my mouth, but I think all my words must have disappeared and my brain stopped working because I couldn't really think of thoughts anymore. Ahmet tapped the envelope in my hand and said, You read it, for me. I tried to take the piece of paper out of the envelope, but there were so many eyes staring at me and Ahmet's eyes looked so big that my fingers got nervous and started to shake. Here, darling, let me help, whispered my mum, as she jumped up and took out the folded paper that lay inside. Opening it up, she held me close as we read it out together. It said, so it looks like quite a formal document. It's not laid out like a normal story. Status. Family investigation summary. Ahmet Sakal, age 9. Father, Mohammed Sakal. Age, 43. Profession, Professor of Engineering. Country of origin, Syria. Status, located, that means they found him, Calais Refugee Camp, France. Mother, Samira Sakal. Age, 45. Profession, journalist. Country of origin, Syria. Status, located, medical facility, Sarak, Turkey. So found both the parents, but they're both in different places. Oh, this one's sad. Sister, Sira Sakal. 3. Deceased. Crossing the Mediterranean. Home Office outcome, granted permanent asylum in the UK, reunification of family imminent. So that means they're all going to get to be back together. I'm not crying at all. I looked up at Mum and then at Ahmed and then at Mum again. What's asylum mean? Mum smiled, but her eyes were watery too. It means they can come and live here, darling. Ahmed's mum and dad are coming to the UK. They've been found. I looked up at Ahmed, who was nodding excitedly, and then I looked up at Josie and Tom and Michael, and they were all staring back at me with their mouths open. And then I looked at Mrs. Khan, who was saying a prayer, and Miss Hensby, who was crying so much that she grabbed Mrs. Sanders and was making her go red in the face. And suddenly Michael jumped up and shouted, "We did it!" And the whole class started cheering and weeping and clapping at once. I know that afternoon was one of the best afternoons I will ever have. Not because it was my birthday, because it was an end to one of the best adventures a brand new 10-year-old could ever have, and the beginning of a whole set of new adventures that I bet Tintin never had. And it was all thanks to a boy who came and sat at the back of the class, and who let me be his friend. Okay, so that's the end of that. So at the back of the book, there's some extra bits of information, and it says, "A special thanks to all the children and the extra nice grown-ups who have read this book. Did you know that by reading and whispering lots about this book, you'll be helping refugee children and their families receive some precious gifts? That is because the author will gift a portion of all the royalties she receives to some wonderfully brave people who spend every single day trying to help save and rebuild the lives of refugees over the world. So whether that's food and water, warm clothes, shelter, or lots and lots of chocolate to help make their inside feel happier, thank you to for each and every gift you'll be helping deliver to refugee children just like Ahmet and their surviving families." So because we bought a copy of this book for every single one of you in year 9, that money from that will go and help refugee children like Ahmet. And there's even a bit more information here. So did you know there are currently 65 million refugees trying to flee ongoing wars, man-made environmental disasters, economic destruction, or political persecution? That's more than the total number of refugees who fled Nazi persecution during World War II. Described as the biggest refugee and displacement crisis of our time by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the ongoing wars in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, and many more mean an increasing number of people are trying to find a safe home elsewhere. Okay, so by reading this story, we've learned a lot about what it's like to be a refugee and you know, what it means to this country. And there's something really interesting here. It says, contrary to the whispers you may have heard, the UK is taking in less than 1% of the world's refugees. So we only have 1% of the world's refugees who living in this country. Because remember, refugees and immigrants are completely different things. Refugees are people who have nowhere to go. Okay, in fact, it is mostly countries outside of Europe that look after 4 out of the 5 world's refugees. Okay, so that's the end of our book. I hope you loved it. Okay, so let's have a look at some activities before we finish. Okay, so there's some kind of questions here that I want you to have a think about in your discussion box. Obviously, these are things that we'd normally talk about in class, but we can't do that at the moment. So I just want you to fill in the box. So question 1, why do you think that some people are scared of people who are different to them? So this is particularly, like Mr. Greggs and Mr. Fry really don't like refugee people. So why do you think some people are scared of them? What do we think about what Josie said here? And everyone needs to help Ahmet find his parents because it's not their fault they've gone missing. So what do you think about that? Do you agree with what Josie said? How did it make you feel when Ahmet said this? I watched as Miss Hemsby helped him translate what he wanted to say into English, but I liked his last answer the best, because when Miss Hall asked him how he felt about what we had done, he looked at us and without any help said, I'm happy to have best friends on planet, and just like that, I knew the answer to my very last question. So how do you feel when Ahmet said that about his friends? What does Grandma Jo mean by this? And I think this is such an important part of the text, guys. I think it was really interesting that the entire world is full of hearts searching for a place to call home, but refugees are different because they don't just look for a home, they look for peace too, and because of that they possess the most special hearts anyone could ever have. So refugees, you know, are just looking for somewhere safe to be. They're just looking for, you know, somewhere they can belong and somewhere they can be safe. So what do you think Grandma Jo meant by that? Why do we think Josie's mum and dad finally changed their mind about Ahmet and the refugees? Okay, and your last task, okay, the last thing you're going to do for me, guys, and this is the thing I'm going to be looking for on enrolment day, okay, is to complete your book review for the boys at the back of the class. So you just have to follow along. I've absolutely loved filming these lessons for you, and I can't wait to see you all in September. See you soon.